Hello, dear listener. A grand salute to the vastness had been given, the correct order for the polar wind's extended rule over the depths of the ocean and the glaciers, before the maintenance of this peace. Whether you are ready to dive in and benefit from the lethargy of summer nights, or you simply wish to free yourself from the hustle and bustle of the modern world and relax with a quiet, immersive historical narrative, I am very, very happy you joined me tonight. Now, would a small introductory session be customary? If you don't mind, is this sound reaching us from all corners of the world? I'd like to know that. From which heroes of Turkey are you listening from, or are you tuning in from another continent? And most importantly, what time of day is it for you right now? Perhaps while I am here experiencing the silence of the night, the sun is just setting or breaking on the horizon. It is always a great pleasure that these history enthusiasts, and those who wish to relax with calm stories find this variety and gather here. If you enjoy this calm, immersive storytelling from the past, do not hesitate to click that subscribe button. In fact, the next episode will never be shared without the appearance of that little icon. With your support, continuing these peaceful journeys becomes much easier. But for now, let all the stresses of the modern world and daily worries melt away. Imagine the calendars show the year 1914. The world is dancing on a tense tightrope in the Great War. Long accumulated tensions between Europe's great powers await like a volcano ready to erupt. Military strategists in these countries are looking for new and devastating ways to gain superiority over the enemy, deliver unexpected blows, and turn the tide of war in their favor. While land and air forces are developing rapidly, the competition at sea is also taking on a different dimension. It is precisely in this period that submarines, these massive metal fish that can be held and navigated underwater, are slowly beginning to appear on the stage of war. But let's pause here and clarify an important detail. Let's not, of course, confuse these 1914 ancestors with today's nuclear-powered, incredibly long-range, comfortable submarines that can stay submerged for weeks. The submarines of those days were quite primitive, almost experimental machines, constantly struggling for survival even in more temperate and known waters, let alone the details of survival accounts in a ruthless and unexplored region like the Arctic. So what does this primitive label mean? Submarines used before 1914 and in the early years of the World War were generally diesel-electric systems. This operating system was quite simple but brought with it endless limitations. While on the surface, the submarine would move forward powered by its diesel engines. These diesel engines not only propelled the submarine but also charged the batteries that would power the electric motors used underwater. However, when they wanted to submerge, they had to shut down the diesel engines and switch to the battery-powered electric motors. This switch meant a change in the submarine's main power source, and the real problem started here: the limited battery life. The battery technology of that era was laughably inadequate even compared to today's smartphone batteries. A submarine could only stay submerged for a few hours at most. When the batteries ran out, the submarine would become virtually immobile, like a stone, and would have to surface. Imagine running out of energy at the most critical moment, perhaps trapped under ice. That was a disaster scenario in itself. It wasn't just the power systems. The whole structure and concealment of the submarine were also a major limitation. Submarines of this period were initially designed for operations in shallow depths. Diving beyond a few hundred feet posed a great risk. The steel alloys and engineering marvels to withstand the immense pressure of the oceans had not yet been discovered. The hulls of World War I submarines had no resilience against the challenges of the Arctic's thick, massive ice sheets, or extreme water pressure. They were practically like reinforced tin cans. Their main purpose was to sneak up on enemy ships to launch torpedoes and patrol in moderately known sea lanes. Scenarios like gliding under the Arctic glaciers, navigating under constantly moving massive ice sheets, or dealing with mechanical failures in freezing cold were not even conceivable for the designers of these divers. These vehicles were built for naval warfare, not for polar expeditions, and they were completely unprepared for the future threats and destructive challenges of the polar geography. From a range perspective, the submarines of 1914 were also severely limited. Visibility underwater was almost zero. Their periscopes could only be used when near the surface, and in an environment like the Arctic, shrouded in fog, darkness, and ice, they were almost useless. Navigation systems were primitive. Magnetic compasses did not work reliably in polar regions, and technologies like satellite systems and GPS were not even dreamed of yet. Maps for unexplored or poorly mapped regions like the Arctic either didn't exist or were extremely inadequate. Determining the submarine's depth and position accurately was a complete nightmare for the crew. For an underwater vessel to proceed into the unknown, surrounded by ice in that region, was tantamount to suicide. Now, let's set aside the technological limitations of World War I submarines and leave ourselves to the arms of the most challenging and greatest enemy of that era, the Arctic itself. This is not just a geographical region. It is a living, breathing monster ready to devour anyone who enters. This white hell, where the most extreme conditions on Earth prevail, was a series of traps for a submarine, especially a 1914 model submarine. First, ice. The Arctic means massive, moving ice floes, thick ice sheets, and icebergs. These formations extended not only on the surface but also deep into the sea. World War I submarines were not designed to navigate under ice. Imagine a towering ice wall appearing in front of you in the water's continuation. The submarine's thin hull would crack like an eggshell. Even modern submarines require specially trained crews and highly advanced sonar systems for under-ice operations. For a 1914 submarine, diving blindly under the ice was suicidal. Hitting an ice mass would cause irreparable damage to the hull, water would start leaking in, and it would mean the end of the submarine. Furthermore, ice was not just a static obstacle. It was a dynamic structure, constantly moving with winds and currents. A submarine could even be trapped under a moving ice sheet while stationary. This meant complete loss of contact with the surface and a reduction of escape ability to zero. The second great enemy was the cold. The freezing cold of the Arctic dropped air temperatures to -degrees and seawater to freezing point. Although the submarine was somewhat isolated from this extreme cold outside, the internal heating systems were extremely primitive and inadequate. The crew was constantly at risk of hypothermia. Machines and sensitive equipment also suffered from the cold. Metal parts expanded and contracted. Delicate mechanisms froze and became inoperable. Diesel engines could freeze. The performance of electric batteries dropped, and pumping systems could ice over. A frozen valve or a burst pipe could directly affect the internal life support systems. Sea spray outside could freeze on the submarine's hull, forming ice layers. This could lead to periscopes, ventilation hatches, and other external equipment becoming unusable. The cold was an insidious enemy that directly threatened not just life, but human survival. The third, and perhaps most disheartening, enemy was darkness. For a large part of the year, especially in the winter months, the Arctic surrenders to the polar night. The sun does not rise above the horizon for weeks, even months. This meant a complete deprivation of natural light. Although there were artificial light sources inside the submarine, this situation exacerbated the psychological deterioration of the crew. The severance of visual contact with the outside world, the feeling of imprisonment, could trigger panic attacks, reduce resilience, and trigger a general moral decay, creating a sense of endlessness. Additionally, darkness made navigation and any external observation impossible. Even during the day, the density of ice and fog could reduce visibility to just a few meters. This situation prevented the submarine from detecting any danger and multiplied the risk of collision. One of the most vital lifelines for submarines in the World War was undoubtedly their fuel. However, these fuel systems were completely inadequate for long-term operations in a remote and isolated region like the Arctic. Submarines of that era typically used heavy fuel oil or diesel. This fuel powered the diesel engines while surfaced, and also charged the batteries for the electric motors. But let's see how fragile the system was under polar conditions. First, the fuel itself was a problem. Heavy fuel oil is a fuel with low viscosity, meaning its fluidity decreases. The colder the air, the more the fuel thickens, becoming almost like molasses. In the freezing cold of the Arctic, the fuel oil in the ship's tanks could not be pumped to the engines fast enough. Clogs could occur in the pipelines. This situation could impair the efficient operation of the diesel engines, or even cause them to stop completely. Imagine the engine starting to sputter while trying to navigate through the ice. It was a complete nightmare. Even storing the fuel near its freezing point put excessive strain on the pumping systems and filters. The second, and perhaps most critical, problem was the submarine's range. 1914 model submarines did not have the capacity to cover thousands of kilometers like today's nuclear submarines. While diesel engines provided a decent range, this was only available while surfaced. The situation changed completely when they submerged. Due to the limited lifespan of the batteries, submarines could only stay underwater for short distances. A few hours of underwater travel were enough to deplete the batteries. This forced the submarine to surface at frequent intervals to recharge the batteries with the diesel engines. Surfacing in a region like the Arctic, filled with ice, was suicidal in itself. The submarine could become trapped under an ice sheet. It might not find a safe spot to surface, or it could get stuck among rapidly forming ice, completely losing its maneuverability. Additionally, surfacing increased the risk of detection by enemy ships or aircraft. During wartime, such a risk could lead to the submarine's destruction. Refueling was a complete mystery. Given the desolate and inaccessible nature of the Arctic, finding a refueling base or a support ship for the machine was almost impossible. A rendezvous with a fuel ship among the ice in the middle of the ocean was no different from a science fiction movie. Therefore, the unit was limited to the fuel it had at the start of its mission, and this posed an insurmountable obstacle to very long-term deployment or operations. When the fuel ran out, the submarine turned into a massive metal coffin adrift in the sea. The crew's chance of survival approached zero. The submarine was like a metal capsule underwater, a living space completely isolated from the outside world. One of the most basic necessities for the survival of the crew in this enclosed environment was breathable air, oxygen, and the preservation of this air's quality. In the submarines of the World War I era, the way these vital needs were met was extremely primitive compared to the advanced life support systems of the modern age. In a merciless structure like the Arctic, the primitiveness of these systems was one of the most important factors leading to their end. While submerged, it was impossible to replenish the submarine with fresh air. The crew had to make do with the limited amount of oxygen they brought with them. The oxygen cylinders of that era were typically stored under high pressure in tanks. These tanks were opened at certain intervals when the oxygen level and the internal air dropped to critical levels. However, this was a manual process, and constantly monitoring the oxygen level and intervening at the right time without error, especially in stressful or emergency situations, was quite difficult. If a tank ran out or malfunctioned, even if there were spares, the depletion of this limited life-giving gas was a problem. Running out of oxygen meant the crew would die. Just obtaining oxygen wasn't enough. Due to the crew's respiration and other sources on the ship, such as diesel engine exhaust, oil vapors, carbon dioxide, CO2, constantly accumulated. CO2 is toxic in high amounts. It causes headaches, nausea, and similar symptoms, and can ultimately lead to loss of consciousness and death. Therefore, the air needed to be constantly filtered and the accumulated CO2 removed. In 1914 model submarines, this was usually done with systems called carbon dioxide scrubbers, which consisted of limestone, calcium hydroxide. These systems would clean the air by absorbing CO2 through chemical reactions. However, these scrubbers also had limited capacities and would be exhausted after a certain period of use. Having spares was mandatory, and the weight and volume of the spares were a serious problem. Additionally, for these systems to work effectively, a certain humidity and temperature balance was required, which was a struggle in itself to maintain in the freezing Arctic environment. The cold could slow down chemical reactions or cause them to malfunction. The only gas threatening the crew inside was not just carbon dioxide. Hydrogen gas could be released during the charging of the batteries. Hydrogen is an explosive gas at high concentrations. This meant that unknowingly, a bomb could be carried inside the submarine. Also, sweat, odors, and other biological waste emitted by the human body worsened the overall air quality, increased humidity, and in cases of prolonged confinement, could pave the way for respiratory diseases. Inadequate ventilation and unfiltered air facilitated the spread of diseases. Considering the necessity for a submarine to stay submerged for a long time in the Arctic, the inability to surface due to ice added another dimension to these oxygen and air filtration problems. When the batteries were being charged, the electric motors were stopped. This meant the fans providing air circulation would also stop. This would leave the crew helpless in a dark, stuffy, and isolated environment. Under these conditions, the capacity of the oxygen tanks and CO2 scrubbers was the most important factor directly limiting the time a unit could stay submerged. The air would run out, CO2 levels would rise, and the crew would become unable to breathe. This was an end as terrifying as freezing or collision. One of the fundamental pillars of survival at sea is not just breathing, but also having potable water. Advanced desalination systems that convert salt water into fresh water, common in today's submarines, were extremely primitive, almost non-existent in the technology of the World War I era. The lack of access to fresh water sources in a remote region like the Arctic posed a threat due to deficiencies. Submarines of that era typically carried limited amounts of fresh water in tanks, proportional to the mission and its priorities. This water was used for both drinking and basic hygiene needs. However, the capacity of these tanks was certainly not sufficient for a polar mission lasting weeks or even months. Each member of the crew had to reduce their daily water consumption to a minimum. Thirst quickly reduced performance, caused energy loss, and led to tension among the crew. Extreme water restriction could lead to serious health problems, dehydration, kidney issues, and ultimately death. So, what options were available for making seawater drinkable? Theoretically, desalination through evaporation was possible. That is, boiling seawater and condensing the steam to obtain fresh water. However, this process presented great difficulties in a closed environment with limited energy like a submarine. First, boiling required a significant amount of fuel. Considering the submarine's already limited refueling capacity, using this method continuously was impossible. Fuel was barely enough for the submarine to move. They couldn't spare an extra gram for boiling water. Secondly, the evaporation process produced a large amount of heat and humidity. In the submarine's already stuffy and humid environment, this created unbearable conditions for the crew, making the internal air even more suffocating. Excessive humidity caused condensation on electronic components and other equipment, increasing the risk of short circuits. Thirdly, maintaining and operating such a system was quite difficult with the science of that time. Complex pipe systems, filters, and condensers were sensitive parts prone to failure. Utilizing the melting of ice in the Arctic might seem like an option. But this was also impractical. The submarine needed to collect the ice from outside and then melt it. This process increased the risk of detection and attack while among the ice, and the melting process again required extra energy. Furthermore, water obtained from melting sea ice was not guaranteed to be completely fresh. Some salt could be trapped during the ice formation. While theoretically possible to collect melted snow or surface ice water, it was practically impossible in terms of the compartment's secrecy and operational safety. Therefore, meeting the drinking water needs of the crew in a World War I submarine in a region completely isolated from the outside world and with zero water supply like the Arctic was an insurmountable problem. Thirst was a factor leading to death faster than hunger, and it was uncertain how long the crew could endure this arduous operation without water, even if the submarine itself remained intact. The lack of access to potable water disrupted the crew's physical functions, crushed morale, and made their survival struggle even more desperate. This situation made long-term operations in the Arctic impossible and was one of the fundamental constraints. In the cold, dark, and humid depths of a submarine, nourishment is as essential as oxygen and water for survival. However, in the submarines of the World War I era, food safety and storage conditions were nothing short of an invitation to disaster for a long-term, isolated deployment like in the Arctic. In an age without modern refrigerators and freezers, keeping supplies fresh required a miracle in itself. Submarines of that era were typically stocked with foods with a low risk of spoilage, such as canned goods, salted meat and fish, dried fruits, biscuits, and crackers. Although fresh vegetables and fruits were sources of vitamins, they were almost never carried due to limited storage space and rapid spoilage. Those that were carried could only stay fresh for a few days. This situation would lead to nutrient and vitamin deficiencies for the team. Especially among sailors, vitamin C deficiency was a common problem leading to scurvy. Scurvy, which could progress to death in advanced stages, manifested with symptoms such as bleeding gums, joint pain, slow wound healing, and general weakness. During a long-term polar mission, with no medical aid available, such a condition would be a death sentence for the crew. The food storage conditions were a nightmare in themselves. Inside the submarine, despite the Arctic cold, humid and variable temperatures could occur due to heat from the engine and equipment. This environment created an ideal breeding ground for microorganisms and food spoilage. Even canned goods could leak and their contents spoil if exposed to extreme temperature fluctuations or impacts. Salted meats and fish could become moldy or infested with worms if not stored properly. Rats and other pests could also pose a problem on the ship, damaging supplies. Storage space was a severe constraint. In the already narrow and cramped interior of the submarine, where it was difficult to find space for the crew themselves, storing enough food for weeks or months was physically challenging. Food was stacked under the bunks where the crew slept, in narrow corridors, or near engine rooms. This led to hygiene issues and accelerated food spoilage. Damage, moisture, or mixing of food packages was also common. The psychological effects cannot be ignored. Constantly eating the same monotonous food seriously lowered the crew's morale. Deprivation of fresh food, the monotony, and the confinement deeply shook the crew's mental state and resilience. Hunger and poor nutrition were triggers for irritability, despair, and paranoia. This could fuel friction among the crew and break down discipline in the already harsh polar conditions. In a scenario where communication with the outside world in the Arctic was nearly impossible, resupplying food was beyond imagination. For any support ship to reach the submarine among the glaciers, or for the submarine to reach a safe port, was extremely difficult. Therefore, once a submarine entered the Arctic, it had to make do with the provisions it had. These limitations, along with rapidly spoiling food, made long-term survival for the crew impossible and constituted one of the major obstacles. When the submarine dived into the freezing waters of the Arctic in its steel hull, protecting the crew inside from the brutal cold outside was of vital importance. However, the heating systems in World War I-era submarines were no match for the difficulty of this task. This constantly exposed the crew to the risk of hypothermia, turning the submarine into a floating block of ice. The submarines of that era did not have complex structures similar to the central heating systems of modern ships. The internal temperature was maintained using waste heat from the engine exhaust and a limited number of steam or electric heaters. But these fluctuations were completely inadequate against polar temperatures, which hovered below zero. The freezing cold of the submarine's steel components was easily transmitted inside. The walls and floors would be ice cold. The bunks where the crew slept, their clothes, and blankets were insufficient to protect them from the cold. Prolonged exposure had a devastating effect on the crew's daily performance. Hypothermia, a dangerous drop in body temperature, was a major threat. Shivering, lethargy, loss of coordination, confusion, and ultimately loss of consciousness and death were the stages of hypothermia. Having to live constantly in damp, wet clothes in the submarine's cramped environment further increased the risk of hypothermia. Many crew members lived with a constant feeling of cold. This distracted them and made it difficult to perform their duties. Serious health issues like frostbite on fingers and toes, nerve damage, and gangrene became inevitable. The cold didn't only affect people, it also affected the submarine itself. Mechanical systems and sensitive equipment performed poorly in extreme cold. Lubricating oils congealed, metal parts contracted, and tolerances changed. This could lead to failures in engines, pumps, valves, and hydraulic systems. Battery performance, in particular, was severely affected by the cold. Low temperatures reduced the battery's storage and power delivery capacity. This further shortened the submarine's underwater endurance. Valves for ballast tanks used to expel seawater or parts of torpedo tubes could freeze. This could cause a loss of control or serious safety breaches for the submarine. Considering the impossibility of refueling in the Arctic, spending extra fuel for heating was a luxury. The already limited fuel was barely enough for the submarine to move. This meant the crew had to forego heating comfort. The lack or failure of heaters made the internal air even more stifling. It caused moisture to condense and form layers of ice on metal surfaces. This icing made the ship's interior even more uninhabitable. Consequently, the primitive heating systems of World War I submarines would completely fail to provide protection in the freezing cold of the Arctic. Hypothermia, frostbite, and equipment failures were significant factors that threatened the crew's physical and mental faculties, reduced the submarine's capabilities to zero, and ultimately destroyed their chances of survival. Under these conditions, the operating crew had to fight not only external enemies but also the insidious, chilling cold inside their own ship. Navigating the submarine through the vast, ice-covered waters of the Arctic was akin to a blind person trying to find their way through a maze. The navigation and mapping technologies of the World War I era were completely inadequate under the extraordinary and relentless conditions of this geography. The conveniences we have today, like GPS satellites, digital maps, or advanced sonar systems, were mere science fiction at the time. This technological blindness largely sealed the submarine's fate. First, magnetic compasses did not work reliably in the Arctic. As one approached the magnetic North Pole, the compass needle deviated from true north and eventually began to spin meaninglessly. This phenomenon, called magnetic deviation, was so severe in polar regions that the compass became useless as a navigation tool. When a ship's basic direction-finding tool became useless, determining direction became impossible. Gyro compasses, also used alongside the magnetic compass, were not yet fully reliable in that period and were not advanced enough to completely replace the magnetic compass. This forced the submarine to proceed blindly. The second major problem was the lack of mapping. The Arctic in 1914 was a largely unexplored and unmapped region. Submarines did not have detailed bathymetric charts, seafloor depth maps, or current maps showing ice formations. Existing maps were based on rough measurements from ordinary surface ships and were far from reliable. Imagine moving underwater, risking collision with an iceberg or a seamount, with no guide showing where you are or what lies ahead. Collisions were almost inevitable. Visual navigation was also impossible. A submarine on a mission often had to stay submerged for long periods, and underwater visibility often did not exceed a few meters. Periscopes could only be used when near the surface. However, the Arctic surface was often foggy, snowy, or covered in ice, preventing even periscopes from making healthy observations. Observing the course on the surface was often impossible, both because it risked detection and due to massive ice flows. The lack of visual references made navigation even more complex. The constantly shifting ice cover and currents in the Arctic made navigation even more difficult. Ice masses constantly moved with winds and ocean currents, creating an unpredictable labyrinth for the submarine's planned route. A seemingly clear path one moment could turn into a massive ice barrier a few hours later. It was impossible for a unit to accurately predict this dynamic environment. The submarine could become trapped in this moving ice labyrinth, drifting into unknown and dangerous waters. Consequently, finding an accurate path in the Arctic was an insurmountable task for World War I submarines. The failure of magnetic compasses, lack of mapping, impossibility of visual navigation, and constantly changing ice conditions left them at the mercy of fate. A single navigation error could lead to the submarine being crushed under the ice, colliding with an iceberg, or getting lost. This was an additional source of despair for the crew already struggling with cold, lack of air, and thirst, and was one of the biggest factors making the submarine's survival in the Arctic impossible. World War I submarines were fundamentally designed to operate in near-shore, shallow waters and open seas. Their raison d'etre was to stealthily approach enemy ships and strike with torpedoes. However, the underwater world beneath the Arctic ice was the complete opposite of this design, and left the submarines of that era desperately inadequate for this extreme theater. But it wasn't just a technical deficiency, it was an existential mismatch for the vessel. Today's modern nuclear submarines can operate under ice, avoid icebergs thanks to their specialized sonar systems and reinforced hulls, and even have special equipment for surfacing through ice. In contrast, 1914 model submarines were so fragile that they could suffer serious damage from the slightest contact with ice, let alone maneuver under it. The submarine's outer hull was not built to withstand extreme pressure. The main pressure-bearing structure was the inner hull, with an outer hull forming a casing. This thin casing could tear upon impact with a piece of ice, leading to water leaks and dangerous weaknesses in pressure levels. One of the most important factors making movement under ice impossible was the limited maneuverability. An iceberg is not just the visible part on the surface. A large part is hidden underwater, and there can be ice ridges or underwater ice shelves extending for kilometers. For a submarine to navigate under these massive and invisible ice formations, it needed to constantly change depth, i.e., dive and surface. However, the ballast tank systems of that era were not as fast and precise as those of modern submarines. Filling or emptying the ballast tanks was a time-consuming and crude process. It was very difficult for the submarine to change depth quickly when encountering sudden obstacles under the ice. Trying to avoid an obstacle could lead to a collision with an ice mass due to loss of control or insufficient maneuverability, causing the hull to be crushed or imploded. Furthermore, periscope use was useless in under-ice operations. The periscope, the eye of the submarine, could not be used to observe the surface when it was covered in ice. While under the ice, the submarine was literally blind. Sonar systems either did not exist at the time or were so primitive that they could not be used to reliably detect ice masses and accurately determine their distances. This meant the submarine advanced into the unknown, risking collision with an obstacle at any moment. Another challenge for under-ice capability was the submarine's noise level. Diesel-electric systems were not as quiet as modern submarines. Even when moving underwater, a certain level of noise emanated from the engines, pumps, and other systems. This noise increased the risk of acoustic detection, though there was likely no one to detect them in the Arctic, and also made it difficult for the crew to use their own primitive listening devices. The signals of navigation and sonar could be distorted, echoing off the ice. A submarine mission always carried certain risks. However, in a merciless and isolated environment like the Arctic during World War I, emergency situations for submarines were nearly hopeless, with their chances of rescue being zero. Advanced escape capsules, emergency signal flares, or satellite-assisted distress call systems found in modern submarines were space-age dreams for 1914 technology. Once a submarine became trapped or disabled in the ice, its crew was largely left to their fate. Even the simplest emergency scenario, such as the submarine's batteries dying or a motor failure, turned into a massive crisis in the Arctic. In the open sea, it might be possible to surface and wait for help, but in the Arctic, if there was a meter-thick ice sheet on the surface, the crew would be trapped inside like a coffin. Breaking through the ice layer to surface was impossible with the submarine technology of that era. The hull was not designed to withstand the pressure of the ice, and such an attempt would have led to the hull being crushed. Rescue operations were purely fictional. The Arctic was a region crossed only by rare expeditions at that time, largely uncharted and inaccessible. There were no ships regularly sailing the area or a rescue infrastructure. The infrastructure for a submarine to send a distress signal was insufficient. Wireless telegraphy, radio, was not advanced enough for submarines to use underwater. Even if they surfaced and could send a radio signal, it was a great mystery how far this signal would travel and whether anyone was listening. Even if a signal was received, it could take weeks or even months for a rescue ship to reach the area, if it could reach it at all. Sea ice would impede the progress of rescue ships, also endangering them. The crew had almost no chance of abandoning the submarine. The submarines of that era lacked modern escape capsules or individual rescue equipment. If the submarine began to sink or flood, attempting to exit through the hatches in freezing cold and under pressure would immediately lead to a cold shock response and drowning. Even if they jumped into the water, survival in the icy water for more than a few minutes was impossible. Any life rafts or lifebelts they might carry would be useless in such conditions. The worst-case scenario was the submarine being damaged under the ice and starting to flood. In that case, the only thing to do was to try to slow the flooding and resign themselves to their fate. Without rescue teams or support ships, there was no hope for a submarine crew stranded so mercilessly. Any mechanical failure, a collision with ice, or any problem could trap the crew in their metal coffin, completely cut off from the outside world, left to die. This was one of the most dramatic and hopeless factors making survival in the Arctic impossible. The struggle for survival on a World War I submarine in the Arctic was not limited to mechanical failures or dangers of attack. The real battle was fought within the crew's own inner world. The psychological effects of prolonged confinement in a dark, cold, and isolated state deeply shook the crew's morale and mental resilience, reducing their operational efficiency to zero and seriously diminishing their chances of survival. Imagine the interior of a submarine, narrow and cramped. A World War I submarine housed approximately 30 to 40 people. This many people had to live for weeks, even months, inside a tube consisting only of narrow corridors and small cabins. There was no privacy. Personal space was minimal. They constantly felt each other's breath on their necks. As this situation continued, it wore down nerves, reduced tolerance, and caused even the smallest issues to turn into major arguments. Tensions, fights, and discipline problems among the personnel were inevitable. One of the biggest challenges was sensory deprivation. There was almost no visual or auditory contact with the outside world. Not seeing sunlight led to long-term vitamin D deficiency, which was a trigger for depression. Inside the submarine, there was monotonous, dim, artificial lighting. There were no natural sounds like the wind or the splash of waves. Only the hum of machines, the sound of pumps, and the whispers of the crew were present. This constant environment could lead to mental fatigue, hallucinations, and detachment from reality. When deprived of natural stimuli, the human mind could create its own dark corners. The uncertainty of the future deeply affected morale. A submarine in the Arctic was at constant risk of colliding with an iceberg, experiencing engine failure, or running out of fuel. In this isolation, where the possibility of rescue was close to zero, the crew lived with a constant fear of death. This persistent stress and anxiety disrupted sleep patterns, caused loss of appetite, and created a general state of exhaustion. Sleep deprivation impaired judgment and led to errors. In a sensitive machine like a submarine, Assembled with such precision, such errors could be fatal. The deterioration of hygiene conditions was another factor leading to moral decay. Limited fresh water and lack of showering options prevented regular cleaning. Constant sweat, grime, and body odors made the already narrow environment even more unbearable. This increased both physical health risks and caused the crew's self-respect and general motivation to plummet. Consequently, the crew of a World War I submarine in the Arctic had to fight not only external enemies but also the psychological pressures arising from their own minds and the closed environment. Sensory deprivation, claustrophobia, lack of privacy, and hygiene problems crushed the crew's morale, triggering panic attacks and psychological breakdowns. This situation reduced the submarine's operational capability to zero. It increased distrust among the crew and completely eradicated any chance of survival. For a ship's crew is only as strong as its mental health, and the Arctic was the most merciless examiner of this strength. World War I submarines were fundamentally composed of a series of complex mechanical systems: engines, pumps, valves, hydraulic components, and electrical systems. Each was designed to perform optimally under specific conditions. However, the merciless and freezing cold of the Arctic pushed these systems beyond their endurance limits, dooming them to malfunctions and complete failure. Every single bolt and gasket of the submarine was a potential weak link in this grand scheme. The engines, among the most critical systems, both diesel and electric, were directly vulnerable to the extreme cold. Diesel engines required a certain temperature to operate. The freezing or increased viscosity of fuel oil in the lines could prevent fuel from reaching the engines. Lubricating oils in the cylinders would also thicken, making the engine harder to turn over, potentially leading to overheating and, ultimately, engine seizure. The batteries for the electric motors rapidly lost capacity in the cold. Just like a phone battery dies faster in winter, the massive submarine batteries weakened in the polar cold, dramatically shortening the submarine's underwater endurance. Hydraulic and mechanical systems were also at great risk. Vital components like the ballast tank valves controlling the submarine's depth, the hydraulic mechanisms raising and lowering the periscope, or the torpedo tubes operated using fluid or air pressure. The fluids, oils, and moisture in the air used in these systems could freeze solid in the frigid cold, or ice could form in the pipes. A frozen valve could prevent a ballast tank from functioning correctly, leading to a loss of control over diving or surfacing. A jammed torpedo hatch would nullify both attack capability and pose a safety risk. Pump systems faced similar difficulties. Water pumps were vital for draining accumulated water inside the submarine or taking water into the ballast tanks. Freezing could shatter the impellers or burst the pipes inside these pumps. This would lead to water leaks and the submarine's inability to manage water inside the hull, which was also a danger for electrical systems due to the risk of short circuits. The insulation properties of electrical cables could also be affected by the cold, becoming brittle and cracking, leading to short circuits. All external mechanisms of the submarine, from periscope lenses to ventilation hatches, sensors, and even primitive sonar transducers if they existed, faced the danger of icing. Ice layers forming on these external systems could render them completely useless. If the external lens of the periscope iced over, seeing outside became impossible. If air intake and exhaust vents froze, the internal air circulation would rapidly deteriorate. The Arctic is not just a static ice sheet. The waters beneath it are constantly in motion, and these movements also drag the surface ice masses. For World War I submarines, these ocean currents and moving glaciers made navigation even more complex, increasing the risk of collision and adding the danger of being crushed. A 1914 submarine, lacking modern oceanographic data and advanced sonar systems, was advancing blindly into this dynamic and dangerous labyrinth. First, powerful ocean currents were a problem in themselves. Deep ocean currents exist in the Arctic, particularly around Greenland and the Canadian archipelago. These currents could drag a submarine moving underwater in unexpected directions, altering its planned course. It was nearly impossible to accurately determine the submarine's position and speed without knowing the strength and direction of the current. Progressing against the current led to higher fuel consumption, further shortening the already limited range. Drifting with the current meant the submarine could lose control entirely and be swept into unknown, dangerous areas like shallow reefs or underwater ice ridges. This loss of control created great psychological pressure on the crew, heightening the feeling of helplessness as their ship was moved not by their own will, but by natural forces. The second, and perhaps greater, danger was the mobility of the glaciers. The ice cover in the polar region constantly shifts and changes place with winds and ocean currents. Sometimes massive icebergs, sometimes ice fields stretching for kilometers, these giants moved insidiously. World War I submarines had no sonar systems, or ones inadequate for detecting underwater ice masses. This meant that while moving underwater, the submarine could encounter a moving wall of ice at any moment. Such a collision would cause serious damage to the submarine's hull, leading to water leakage and potentially sinking. Moreover, these moving ice formations could also block the submarine's escape route. A thick ice sheet forming over the submarine while it was trying to surface could trap it in the depths. The pressure from the ice could crush the submarine's outer hull, jam the escape hatches, and doom the crew to death by asphyxiation or flooding. Open water leads for surfacing could similarly close or refreeze very quickly. This created a vicious cycle that rapidly consumed the already limited oxygen supply. These invisible dangers created constant tension and stress for the submarine crew. The risk of collision or entrapment at any moment made an already harsh and difficult environment even more unbearable. No matter how skilled and disciplined the crew was, they had no means to counter these massive and unpredictable forces of nature. Ocean currents and moving glaciers were fundamental and merciless realities that made survival in the Arctic impossible for World War I submarines. The submarine was doomed in this dynamic labyrinth of ice and water. For a submarine, navigation is the most basic condition for survival at sea. However, the navigation technology of the World War I era was utterly helpless against the unique magnetic field of the Arctic. Without precise tools like modern gyro compasses or global systems like GPS, a 1914 model submarine finding its direction in the polar region was no different from a blind man lost in a maze. This situation plunged the submarine into uncertainty and the crew into constant anxiety. The biggest problem was the failure of the magnetic compass, the crew's primary navigation tool. As one approaches the Earth's magnetic poles, the compass needle deviates severely towards magnetic north instead of pointing to true north. In the Arctic, this deviation is so great that the compass needle begins to spin erratically or refuses to give a stable reading. This phenomenon, known as magnetic variation or declination, could not be accurately compensated for with the technology of 1914. Deprived of its basic direction-finding tool, it became impossible for the submarine to proceed on a correct course and reach an intended target. This created a constant feeling of being lost and hopelessness for the team. Besides the magnetic compass, The gyro compasses used in that era were also not ideal for polar regions. Gyro compasses operate based on the Earth's rotation to find true north. However, due to the proximity to the Earth's rotational axis in polar regions and changes in gravitational forces, gyro compasses could also produce erroneous and faulty readings. Furthermore, gyro compasses were large, heavy, and complex systems. They required frequent calibration and were prone to failure. Ensuring such a sensitive device functioned correctly in the submarine's narrow and humid environment was quite difficult. Carrying a spare gyro compass was not always feasible. Astronomical observations used for navigation, using the sun and stars, were generally inapplicable in the Arctic. The fact that the Arctic is in constant darkness or twilight for a large part of the year, especially in winter, made observing the sky impossible. Even observations made with the periscope were often futile due to fog, snowstorms, and dense ice cover. The effort to surface for observation also risked detecting the submarine and causing it to become trapped among the ice. World War I submarines operating in the most remote regions of the world, like the Arctic, had to contend not only with natural dangers but also with a complete severance of connection to the outside world. Communication technologies were not advanced in 1914, and this condemned the submarine crew to a completely isolated existence. Calling for help, receiving information, or being aware of any developments was a dream. The primary means of communication for submarines of that era was wireless telegraphy, or radio. However, these radio systems did not work underwater. Radio waves can only travel very short distances in water and cannot be transmitted efficiently. This made it mandatory for the vessel to surface for communication. As we mentioned in previous analyses, surfacing in the Arctic was suicidal in itself. A thick ice sheet could physically prevent surfacing or cause the submarine to be crushed while trying to surface among the ice. Furthermore, a surface submarine risked detection by potential enemy ships or aircraft. This risk was unacceptably high during wartime. Even if they managed to surface, the range of the transmitted radio signal was quite limited. Shortwave radio technology was still in its infancy, and reliable communication over long distances was difficult. The nearest communication station in a desolate region like the Arctic could be thousands of kilometers away. This meant that a sent distress call, a malfunction report, or a positional report might never reach its recipient. It was also a matter of chance whether a permanent station was constantly open and monitoring the frequency. Additionally, geomagnetic storms in the polar regions, such as the aurora, northern lights, could seriously disrupt radio communication, causing signal distortion or complete disconnection. These natural phenomena rendered the already weak communication systems even more dysfunctional. The crew's disconnection from the outside world was not just a technical matter, it also had a profound psychological impact. Not hearing from their families, friends, or the progress of the war deeply shook the crew's morale and motivation. This feeling of helplessness fueled loneliness, despair, and hopelessness. Not knowing what was happening outside increased the crew's stress levels and eroded their resilience. The failure of an expected rescue operation to arrive or a message going unanswered pushed the crew deeper into despair. One of the most basic needs for a submarine's survival is its ability to withstand the immense pressure when submerged. However, the whole structures and construction methods of World War I submarines were utterly inadequate against the extreme depths and, especially, the external pressure applied by ice sheets encountered in the Arctic. This inadequacy rendered the compartment as fragile as a thin eggshell, ready to be crushed at any moment. The submarines of that era were generally constructed of high-tensile steel. However, the manufacturing conditions and techniques were quite primitive compared to modern submarines. Their designs were optimized for operations in shallow depths of a few hundred meters in open seas. The engineering knowledge and material technology to withstand pressures of tons per square millimeter in the deeper layers of the ocean did not yet exist. In the Arctic, the submarine had to contend not only with water pressure but also with the additional pressure from being under glaciers and ice masses or their movements. Being trapped under an ice sheet could apply incredible pressure on the submarine's hull from the sides and above. This pressure would rapidly compromise the compartment's structural integrity, potentially causing steel plates to buckle and rivets or welds to fail. Every penetration point on the submarine's hull, pipe inlets, hatches, cable passages, etc., was a potential weak point. The risk of water leakage from these points under pressure was very high. The smallest crack formed under the pressure of the ice could rapidly expand, causing large amounts of water to flood into the submarine. Incoming water would lead to short circuits in electrical systems, battery failures, and a loss of buoyancy. The submarine would begin to sink uncontrollably deeper and ultimately implode under the increasing pressure. Furthermore, the hull design of the submarine lacked the ability to maneuver under ice or break ice. The hull was equipped with sensitive propellers, rudders, and external sensors that could easily be damaged upon impact with ice. Modern submarines have reinforced sails or special ice-breaking capacity for surfacing through ice, which 1914 submarines lacked. The bow of World War I submarines was designed not for breaking ice but for entering the water more easily. This would cause the front section to deform easily upon contact with ice. If the submarine remained under ice for extended periods, a serious problem of ice accumulation on the external surfaces could occur. This accumulated ice both increased the submarine's weight and had negative hydrodynamic effects. Additionally, the icing over of periscopes, sensors, and other exposed devices on the list would reduce their capability to zero. Serving on a World War I submarine already carried health risks. However, in a merciless and isolated environment like the Arctic, where the possibility of medical assistance was nearly zero, the crew was left completely helpless against the simplest health problems or injuries. The submarine turned into a narrow, unhygienic living space, more akin to a breeding ground where diseases could easily spread, rather than an operating room. Submarines of that era typically did not have a full-time doctor. Medical duties on these vessels, operating with a small crew, were handled by a medically trained petty officer or a sailor with a first aid kit. These kits contained only basic bandages, antiseptics, painkillers, and perhaps a few simple medications. Effective treatment for a serious injury, such as a burn from a machine malfunction, a broken limb, or internal bleeding, was impossible with the limited capabilities available. At best, they could try to alleviate pain and prevent the condition from worsening. The closed, humid, and stuffy environment of the submarine provided an ideal breeding ground for diseases. A simple cold or flu affecting one crew member could rapidly spread throughout the entire ship. Common areas, inadequate ventilation, and lack of hygiene allowed bacteria and viruses to spread easily. An epidemic could incapacitate a large portion of the crew, completely crippling the submarine's operational capability. Being trapped for a long time on a submarine in the Arctic meant not only struggling with ice and cold but also being completely deprived of sunlight, which deeply affected the crew's physical and mental systems. Deprivation of natural light sources, especially in this region dominated by the polar night for most of the year, led to vitamin D deficiency and a host of associated health problems, seriously reducing the chances of survival. The human body synthesizes a large part of its vitamin D in the skin when exposed to sunlight. Vitamin D is vital for bone health, the immune system, and general mood. Although artificial lighting inside the submarine provided some light, this light lacked the spectrum of natural sunlight and was completely insufficient for vitamin D synthesis. After a mission lasting weeks or even months, severe vitamin D deficiency would appear in almost the entire crew. The physical effects of vitamin D deficiency were devastating. One of the most prominent issues was the deterioration of bone health. In adults, it led to conditions like osteomalacia and osteoporosis. Scurvy, which we mentioned earlier, also deeply affected the crew's physical and mental performance, making it impossible for them to fulfill their duties. The progression of poor nutrition policy made them more vulnerable to other ailments. Dental problems and other chronic disorders were also frequently seen. Accidents were also inevitable. In the submarine's narrow, machinery-filled environment, injuries from falls, impacts, or crushing were common. The risk of fire was always present. In case of a fire, the resulting smoke and toxic chemicals could seriously damage the respiratory systems. In such emergencies, the lack of basic health infrastructure could lead to fatalities. Vitamin D is also critical for the immune system. Its deficiency reduced the crew's resistance to diseases. One person falling ill in the already closed, stuffy, and crowded submarine environment could quickly turn into an outbreak. Crew members with weakened immune systems would struggle much more severely even with simple colds or flu, and recovery times would lengthen. This also weakened the submarine's operational strength. In addition to physical effects, psychological impacts were also significant. The lack of sunlight directly affected the crew's mood. Sunlight plays a key role in the secretion of neurotransmitters like serotonin, which regulate mood. Lack of natural light could lead to chronic fatigue, irritability, and even clinically diagnosable depression. Feelings of hopelessness, lack of motivation, and increased anxiety levels were observed among the crew. This situation could disrupt the harmony and cooperation of a submarine crew already under high stress. Not knowing the time of day confused the biological clock, the circadian rhythm, and disrupted sleep patterns. Long-term lack of sunlight could also negatively affect the eyes, potentially reducing night vision capability. Working inside the submarine with insufficient light and constantly focusing at the same distance would cause eye strain and headaches. There was no chance of obtaining vitamin D from outside in the Arctic. The medical knowledge and equipment of the time were insufficient to diagnose and address such a deficiency. During this process, the crew had to struggle with these insidious and progressive health problems on their own. Sunlight and vitamin D deficiency emerged as a significant factor that made survival in the Arctic impossible, deeply affecting the crew's general condition, morale, and resilience, just as much as technical or strategic weaknesses. The cold and desolate features of the Arctic were not, contrary to popular belief, completely empty. This merciless geography hosted its own wildlife, and for a World War I submarine, these creatures, especially polar bears, could sometimes pose an unexpected and deadly danger. The struggle for survival outside sometimes meant encountering a predator you never expected. Polar bears were the undisputed largest and most dangerous predators of the Arctic. Their sense of smell was extremely developed, and they could detect the scent of their prey from kilometers away. In scenarios where a submarine surfaced through the ice, opened ventilation hatches, or the crew went outside to check something, the submarine could be perceived as a potential food source by polar bears. Their powerful claws and jaws could leave serious marks even on a metal surface, and could even damage the submarine's thin external hull coatings. Encountering a bear on the submarine's deck or on the ice meant direct death for an unarmed or inadequately armed crew member. In a confined space, there was no escape route, and such an encounter caused panic among the crew. It wasn't just polar bears. Other marine creatures could also create potential dangers. Large whale species or walruses could inadvertently collide with the submarine, causing hull damage. Although this risk was much lower than the risk of colliding with an iceberg, it was still a non-negligible possibility. Walruses, in particular, with their sharp tusks, could even leave marks on the ice. If a submarine remained stationary on the surface, these creatures might approach the ship out of curiosity and damage protruding parts. The risk of encountering wildlife made the necessary surfacing maneuvers for the submarine even more dangerous. When the crew had to surface to recharge batteries or refresh the air, they had to consider not only enemy ships or glaciers but also the wild animals roaming the ice. This made surfacing not just a technical maneuver but a survival test with the potential for a confrontation with an unexpected predator. Even if there was no direct damage from wildlife inside the submarine, there could be indirect moral and psychological effects. The unknown threats outside, the constant need to be on alert, and the feeling that a predator could be lurking right outside increased stress. Especially in a situation where food supplies were limited, the presence of game animals outside could deepen the crew's despair. Now we have reached the end of this freezing and arduous journey. We have examined one by one why submarines from the World War I era could not survive the relentless conditions of the Arctic. This story is not just a list of technological limitations but also a narrative of humanity's desperate struggle against nature's most formidable forces with the most primitive tools, a struggle destined to fail. In short, accomplishing this mission was impossible. First and foremost, technological inadequacy was the fundamental obstacle. 1914 model submarines were not designed to maneuver under ice, stay submerged for long periods, or withstand extreme cold. Their limited battery life, primitive fuel systems, and restricted range made them candidates for running out of power under an iceberg or in the open sea in the Arctic. The freezing of mechanical parts, the solidification of oils, and the failure of sensitive devices could turn the ship into a dysfunctional heap of metal in seconds. Secondly, the merciless nature of the Arctic itself was insurmountable with the technology of that time. The constantly moving, unpredictable ice fragments were a constant threat to the submarine's navigation. Invisible icebergs could easily shatter or trap the ship. The freezing cold affected not only the crew but every single part of the ship, leading to system failures. The perpetual darkness for most of the year made maintenance impossible, and also deeply shook the psychology of those inside. Thirdly, the primitiveness of life support systems could cause the crew to collapse both physically and mentally. Limited oxygen, inadequate air filtration systems, lack of potable water, and spoiling food supplies would quickly leave them facing thirst, hunger, and respiratory problems. Lack of sunlight and vitamin D deficiency would lead to serious health issues like long-term depression and bone problems. The absence of medical assistance and resupply meant that even the simplest ailment could turn into a death sentence. Finally, isolation and lack of communication reduced the chance of rescue in any emergency to zero. Once a submarine entered the icy waters of the Arctic, its connection with the outside world was completely severed. Distress calls went unheard. Rescue teams couldn't reach the area. This made the team feel completely abandoned to their fate, increasing despair and panic. While any one of these reasons alone could spell the end for a submarine crew, when combined, surviving in the Arctic with a submarine during World War I was nothing more than a science fiction scenario. It was technological suicide. I hope this immersive, yet equally chilling, story has both added new things to your knowledge repository and left you feeling comfortably sheltered. What other historical adventures would you like to embark upon next? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. For now, pleasant dreams.